The glass fell onto the marble floor and shattered into 100 pieces. Mara didn't move. She just stared at the ground where the shards caught the morning light, cold, still, and so perfect it was almost terrifying. At the far end of the long dining table, Grant Hayes looked up from his financial paper. His eyes didn't meet hers. 2 years of marriage, not a single touch, not a single night shared. "I'll have someone clean it up," Grant said evenly, his voice flat, emotionless. "No need," Mara replied, bending down to pick up the pieces. A shard sliced her fingertip and blood welled up, a thin, bright red line against the pristine white floor. She looked at her wound and let out a faint, bitter laugh. At least it proved she was still alive. Grant noticed, frowned slightly, and opened his mouth as if to say something, but swallowed the words instead. "As always." The sentence caught in his throat, strangled by the habit of silence. The penthouse on the 58th floor overlooked the city. Everything was luxurious, pristine, and utterly lifeless. In that space, 2 people bound by marriage lived like strangers, sharing a temporary shelter. Mara couldn't even remember the last time she heard her own laughter. Maybe it was before the wedding, back when she was still teaching, when her fingertips were painted with color instead of weighed down by a cold diamond ring. Grant set his coffee cup down. The soft clink echoed like the final period at the end of a failed conversation. He checked the time, adjusted his cufflinks, and stood. "I have an early meeting." "You always do," Mara murmured, softly, but just loud enough for him to hear. Grant paused for a second. Her words weren't an accusation, just a sigh passing between them. He turned toward the window. The city cloaked in mist, skyscrapers swallowed by a silvery haze, the same color as their life together. He'd once believed marriage would reassure his father, convince the board he was stable, keep everything under control. What he hadn't realized was that this arranged marriage would become the one thing he could never control. Mara walked around the table and placed the freshly washed plate on the rack. When she turned back, she saw a white envelope lying in the middle of the table. Neat, cold, and unmistakably Grant's. "From the lawyer," he said. She wiped her hands and opened it. A single line printed cleanly. "Notice, the marriage contract between Grant Hayes and Mara Quinn will expire in 30 days. Mara read it 3 times. Her eyes didn't blink. Not a single tear fell. 2 years of silence had drained her so completely that even her tears no longer saw a reason to fall. "Have you been counting the days?" she asked, her voice calm, unnervingly calm. Grant looked up. "Counting what?" "The days until I disappear from your life." He didn't answer. She smiled, a wisp of a smile, fragile as smoke but laced with quiet irony. "At least this time, you have a clear deadline for everything." Grant stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing the woman before him for the very first time. Her hair was tied neatly, a few strands brushing against her neck. Sunlight fell across her pale but steady face. There was something in her eyes that unsettled him. Not resentment, but calm acceptance. "What will you do after that?" he asked, just to say something. "Go back to teaching, open a small art class, paint things with color." Her last words came softly, like a reminder that the world had once been vibrant, before it turned into a black and white reel titled Grant Hayes. He said nothing. The elevator doors slid shut behind him, the metallic echo lingering in the still air. Mara stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the scent of coffee, silence, and something that had died long ago. Perhaps love. She looked at the envelope on the table, then carefully folded it. 30 days. 30 more days, and she would be free. Free from the man who had never once touched her. But when her fingers brushed over the faint line of dried blood on the broken glass, Mara realized something else was beginning to crack. Not the glass, not her heart, but the calm she had spent 2 years mastering. She lifted her gaze toward the window. Outside, the sun was rising, but inside this home, only the shadows of 2 people remained. Too close to be strangers, too far to still be one. And though she couldn't explain why, a strange feeling stirred in her chest. When the contract ended, something real might finally begin. That evening, the light from her classroom lamp glowed against Mara's face, reflecting off the streaks of paint on her hands. She was setting up easels for the kids coming tomorrow when the sound of the door opening echoed behind her. Not a student, not a parent. Grant. He stood in the doorway, dark suit, loosened tie, looking as if he'd just come from a long, brutal battle. In 2 years, he had never come here, never cared to know how she lived, who she taught, or where. "I need you to come with me," he said, his voice low and direct. Mara paused, turned, and tilted her head slightly. Go where? The energy project launch, at Skyfall. She let out a soft laugh, a sound out of place in the quiet room. Skyfall, the place where important people wear expensive clothes and say things no one remembers. Grant didn't respond. He stepped closer, and the distance between them seemed to shrink inch by inch. The warm ceiling light caught his eyes, icy blue, steady, leaving no room for emotion. The shareholders want to see the image of a stable man, he said. And you're my wife, on paper. On paper is easy, Mara replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but her gaze was unwavering. It's real life that's hard. For a moment, Grant said nothing. No argument, no defense. He just looked at her for a few seconds longer, then turned to leave. You don't have to decide now, he said, hand on the doorknob. The car will pick you up at 6:30 tomorrow evening. The door closed behind him, leaving a faint trace of his cologne hanging in the air, a scent so unfamiliar, yet closer than anything she had felt from him in 2 years. Mara stood still, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the paintbrush. A warmth, sharp and confusing, rippled through her. She couldn't tell whether she was angry at him or at herself for still letting her heart stir because of a man who spoke to her like a contract clause. That night she couldn't paint. Every time the brush touched the canvas, Grant's image bled into the colors, his face, his voice, and that phrase, on paper, looping over and over like a broken song. The next morning, she opened her closet and touched the silver-gray dress sealed in its fabric cover. She had sewn it herself 2 years ago, back when she still believed her husband might one day ask her out, as a real wife, not just a name on paper. She had never worn it. Until tonight. When she stepped out of the car, the cold air brushed against her skin. Grant was waiting, tall and composed, a man carved in precision. His gaze swept over her, pausing for a fraction of a second, as if he were seeing a version of Mara he'd never known existed. You're on time, he said. So are you, she replied, her lips curling into a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. The doors of the Skyfall Hotel swung open. Lights, flashes, voices. Everything glittered, everything felt staged. Grant placed a light hand on her back, a simple gesture, yet it made Mara freeze. It was the first time in 2 years he had touched her, just to guide her toward the cameras, but her heart pounded so hard she feared someone else might hear it. Mrs. Hayes, Grant said in his low, steady tone, introducing her to the wall of flashing cameras. The sound of shutters exploded in bursts. Mara held a smile as thin as a thread, feeling like a finely polished ornament in a portrait that wasn't hers. When the ceremony began, she stood quietly off to the side, a glass of wine untouched in her hand. Grant was talking with investors, the spotlight cutting across his face, confident, flawless, untouchable. She watched him for a moment, then turned away as an emptiness rose inside her, quiet but vast. Excuse me, are you Mara Quinn? A man's voice came from behind her. She turned around. A man about her age stood there, warm smile, familiar brown eyes. Rowan Pierce. We went to college together, didn't we? You teach art, right? Rowan? Mara gasped softly, a rare, genuine spark of joy. Oh my God, how long has it been? A few steps away, Grant heard the laughter. He turned, and in that instant something in his gaze cracked. Mara's smile, the one he hadn't seen in 2 years, was so bright it seemed to drain the color from everything around her. Rowan asked about her art class, the kids she taught, the dreams she once told him about back in school. Mara answered with an easy tone, her eyes alive, glowing. Grant watched in silence, his fingers tightening slightly around the stem of his glass. A PR staffer passed by and whispered to Mara, "You're amazing, Mrs. Hayes. Everyone's talking about you. You and Mr. Pierce look like a perfect match up there." Grant heard every word. He turned away, bringing the glass to his lips, hiding the deepening blue in his eyes. When the event ended, they walked outside. Neither of them spoke on the drive home. Mara watched the city lights flicker across the car window, while Grant stayed silent behind the wheel. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "No need to thank me. I was just playing my part." Part? The wife on paper, remember? Grant said nothing. When the car stopped in front of the building, Mara got out, but he didn't move, just sat there, watching her through the window as her figure disappeared into the night. His hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't know why, but that night, the image of Mara's smile beside Rowan wouldn't leave him. Like a streak of paint he couldn't erase from the wall he'd thought was perfect. The next morning, social media erupted with a photo from the Skyfall launch. Mara was laughing, her head tilted slightly toward Dr. Rowan, while he leaned in to whisper something in her ear. The chandelier light spilled across their shoulders, framing them like a scene cut from a romantic film. The headline beneath read, "Wife of Millionaire Grant Hayes Seen Getting Cozy with Rival Investor." Grant stared at the screen, a faint, blade-thin smile curving his lips. The photo had already spread across every business news site before he even took his first sip of coffee. He read the headline again for the 5th time, feeling the heat build in his palms. Then he tossed the phone onto the table. "Perfect," he muttered. The press finally got what they wanted. His assistant Tom stood nearby, cautious. "Mr. Hayes, we can request the article be taken down, but it's already been shared thousands of times." Grant didn't look up. "Leave it." "Sir?" "The more you try to silence it, the faster it spreads. They feed on blood, not news." When Tom left, Grant remained seated, the light from the tall window cutting across his face, cold, metallic. But in his eyes, something had shifted. A spark, faint but dangerous, had started to flicker. That evening, when Mara came home, she opened the door to find Grant standing in the living room, a newspaper in his hand. The photo printed across the front page. "You seemed to be enjoying yourself at the party," he said. His voice wasn't raised, wasn't angry, just calm, sharp, like cold air. Mara hung her coat over the chair. "You care?" "Don't start, Mara." "Start?" She gave a dry little laugh, setting her bag on the table. "You'd need something to end first before you can start, Grant." He stepped closer, his eyes still carrying that controlled, unreadable look. "Who is he?" "Rowan Pierce. We went to college together. He's an investor. You've heard his name before. And what did he whisper that made you laugh like that?" She met his gaze for a long moment before answering softly. "An old story, about paint and children." Grant drew in a deep breath, as if trying to swallow down something burning in his chest. "The press called it intimate. Do you have any idea what that does?" "Hurts you?" she asked quietly. "Or just the image of you you've worked so hard to keep spotless?" He didn't answer, just looked at her. That look thickened the air between them, heavy and unmoving. Mara stepped closer, standing face to face with him. "Honestly, I don't know whether to laugh or pity you," she said quietly. "For 2 years I've lived next to you like a shadow. And now, because of one photo, you finally look at me. As if I've committed some kind of crime." "It's not a crime," Grant said slowly. "It's just unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" Mara gave a short, brittle laugh, her eyes glistening. "Right, just like me, unnecessary." Silence fell, so deep she could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Grant took half a step back. He knew he'd said the wrong thing, but pride was the only armor he'd never learned to remove. Mara looked at him, her voice quieter now, but cutting like ice. "You've never really looked at me, have you, Grant?" He said nothing. "It's not that you didn't have time," she went on softly. "You were afraid that if you looked long enough, you'd see yourself in my eyes, a man who's empty, cold, and tired." He lifted his head, eyes flashing with anger. "I'm not afraid of anyone." "No," she said softly, "you're just afraid to love, and that's why you choose silence." The words landed like a blade. Grant turned away, his shoulders trembling. "Barely, but real." "I chose safety," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "It sounds cowardly, I know, but it's true. I chose silence to keep everything intact." "Intact?" Mara stepped closer, her eyes burning. "We died in that silence, Grant. There's nothing left to keep." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time in 2 years she saw his eyes glisten. Not much, just a faint sheen along his lashes, but it was enough to make her heart tighten painfully in her chest. She started to turn away, but his voice came fast, almost desperate, as if he were afraid she might vanish before he finished. "That photo, you were really smiling." She froze. "So? I've never seen you smile like that before." Her back still to him, she said quietly, "That's because with you, I was never allowed to." Grant fell silent. He sank into the chair, head in his hands. Mara walked into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and let the sound of running water drown out the pounding in her chest. Part of her wanted to cry. Another part just wanted to disappear. For good. Out in the living room, Grant pulled out his phone and opened the photo again. The light caught her face, not the silent wife he knew, but a woman alive, real, warm. He couldn't hate that image, but the longer he looked, the more something fierce and unnameable burned in his chest. When Mara came back, he was still staring at the screen. She stopped in the doorway. "You know what, Grant?" she said. He looked up. "I wasn't smiling because of Rowan. I smiled because, for the first time in 2 years, someone asked me if I was happy. And you know what? I didn't know how to answer." She walked past him, leaving behind a faint trail of perfume, warm, unfamiliar, utterly unlike the cold stillness of the house. Grant lifted his head to watch her go, a strange ache rising inside him, the urge to reach out, colliding with the helplessness of not knowing where to begin. He sat there long after her door closed. In the darkness, he whispered, almost to himself, "I'm not afraid to love, Mara, I'm afraid to lose." But no one heard it. Only the sound of wind against the window, and the glow of the phone screen, the photo still open, her smile frozen in time, quietly breaking his carefully built world apart. The next morning, the penthouse was unusually silent. Mara was gone. She'd left a short note on the dining table. "I'm going back home for a few days. Don't worry, there's nothing left to lose." Her handwriting was neat and steady, but Grant could see the faint tremor at the end of each word. He held the note, standing in the kitchen where everything was in its perfect place, except her. The emptiness hit him not with noise but with weight, heavy and slow, as if a piece of him had been quietly removed and he couldn't tell which part it was. Grant walked past her room, and for the first time in 2 years, he opened the door. The space was small, bright, and so simple it hardly looked like the room of a millionaire's wife. On the desk sat an unfinished canvas, colors bleeding halfway across the surface. He stepped closer and noticed a small wooden box on the shelf. Without knowing why, he opened it. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each marked in the same delicate handwriting, "To Grant." He sat down and opened the first one. Day 27. "You still haven't said anything. Today I learned how to make coffee the way you like it, even though you never told me how. I left the cup outside your office door. I don't know if you drank it." Grant's throat tightened. He reached for another. Day 143. "You asked if I needed anything. I said no. The truth is, I just needed you to ask again. But you didn't. I think maybe you've forgotten what it feels like to need someone." He set the letter down, took a deep breath, and reached for another. The paper trembled faintly in his hands. Day 372. "I dreamed I was teaching again. In the dream, you were sitting in the back row. You didn't speak. You just watched. Maybe that's the only time I've ever felt you truly existed in my world." Grant leaned back in the chair. Every line cut into the part of him he'd long believed numb. He didn't know how long he sat there, only that by the time he opened the last envelope, his hands were damp. "Grant, if you're reading this, it means I no longer have the strength to stay silent. There's something I've never told you. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I was afraid you'd feel deceived. I didn't marry you out of love. Not then. I did it because they threatened to shut down the community art center. The one your mother founded. The place where poor kids could learn to paint. After she died, the funding stopped. They told me that if I agreed to this marriage, they'd save it. And I believed them. I was wrong. Not because of the choice I made, but because I thought you'd never need to know." Grant let the letter fall from his hands. His heart pounded painfully, as if it were being crushed from the inside. He stood, walked to the window, and drew in a breath, but even the air felt like it had left him. He remembered the day his father forced the marriage on him. "You need someone like her," his father had said. "The media loves her. The public trusts her. She's perfect for your image." Grant hadn't argued. He'd simply nodded, treating the marriage as another safe investment, a deal to protect his empire. Now he understood. She had paid for it, with her freedom, her pride, and the last piece of herself, to preserve what his mother had loved most. He turned back to the table and gathered all the letters, arranging them in a neat line. Each envelope was a slice of time, a confession from 2 years of her life beside him. 2 years he'd never truly seen her. One of the last envelopes slipped from his hand and drifted to the floor. He bent to pick it up, eyes scanning the first line, and froze. "Grant, there's something I once hid, not out of fear, but because I didn't know how to say it. Before I married you, I was pregnant. The baby never made it to this world. Since then, I haven't known how to believe in beautiful dreams. Maybe that's why I agreed to a marriage without touch, because when you've already lost a life, you stop trusting yourself with anything fragile enough to love." The world tilted. Grant sank to the floor, his knees pressing against the cold marble. His vision blurred, and his voice broke into a whisper. "God." Then he wept. Not loudly, not theatrically, just tears falling one by one, heavy as metal. For 2 years he'd believed he felt nothing. But the truth was simpler, crueler. He'd only been afraid to feel anything at all. Fragments of memory crashed over him. The quiet, ordinary things he dismissed without thought. The cup of coffee that was always warm each morning, though he never drank it. The office door left slightly open to let in light, though he preferred it closed. The cup of tea, waiting by his bedside every night, cooling with time. She had spoken to him every day, just not with words, and he, blind and foolish, had never learned to understand her silence. Grant opened the desk drawer and pulled out an old photo frame, their wedding picture. Mara in her white dress, not smiling broadly, just a small, quiet curve of her lips as if hiding something. Back then, he'd thought it was shyness. Now he saw it for what it was, pain. He sat for hours in his study, the lights off, the only glow coming from the computer screen. Faint, cold, reflecting the face of a man who had just realized he'd lost the most important thing in his life while it was still in his hands. Outside, rain began to fall, heavy, steady, relentless. Grant lifted his gaze toward the window, her words echoing through his mind. "You're afraid to love, so you choose silence." She was right. He had chosen safety, and in doing so had traded away the only person who'd ever stayed. He folded the last letter carefully, as though it might tear if he breathed too hard. Then he placed the wooden box back into the drawer, but his hands refused to let go. And for the first time in his life, Grant Hayes, the man the world called the cold genius, sank to his knees in the middle of his own room. Alone, shattered, haunted by the image of the woman he had never truly touched. 3 days later, Mara returned. The penthouse looked exactly the same, but the air had changed. It was no longer quiet. It was heavy, dense, like smoke that refused to clear. Grant stood by the window, his back straight, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the ice long melted. He turned when he heard her footsteps. "You're back," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, just to pick up the rest of my things." She didn't look at him, just walked straight to her room. He set the glass down and followed, stopping at the doorway. "Where will you go?" "I don't know yet, but not here." Grant swallowed hard, forcing his tone to stay calm. "You can stay, at least until—" "No," she cut in. "I've accepted a job with Rowan, an art education project for kids in Westbridge. It's about 2 hours from here." He froze, his eyes darkening. "I'll fund it. Whatever it costs, I'll—" "Don't," Mara said softly but firmly. "You can't buy back trust with money, Grant. Not when you're the one who broke it." He took a step closer. "I'm not trying to buy you, Mara. I just want you to stay." "Stay for what?" She turned to face him, her eyes steady and sharp. "To stay silent for another 2 years? Or to make sure you have someone to sign next to you on the shareholder reports?" He drew in a breath, but no words came out. She could see it, the anger pressed down behind his eyes, but beneath it, confusion, like a man standing in the wreckage of something he built and didn't know how to rebuild. "I'll send the divorce papers soon," she said, her voice calm, cruelly calm. "This time, I'll sign first." Grant wanted to speak, to argue, to stop her, but his throat closed. He could only watch as she walked past him, suitcase in hand, leaving the apartment that had never once felt like home. The news broke the next afternoon. Across every financial outlet, the headline blazed. Hayes Tech shareholders question CEO's capability amid personal scandal, call for temporary suspension. Grant slammed the newspaper onto the table, the headlines blurring before his eyes. He wasn't a man afraid of losing power. But for the first time, he felt fear. Not of the title, of everything collapsing at once, the company, the reputation, and the only person he still wanted to hold on to. Tom, his assistant, stepped into the room. "They'll announce the interim CEO tomorrow morning. You'll need to prepare a statement." "No need." "Grant, you can't just—" "Tom," his voice was hoarse, low, cutting through the air like gravel. "Do you know where Mara is?" Tom hesitated, then nodded slightly. "An old apartment near Riverside. I think she's just staying there for now." Grant nodded without another word. When Tom left, he sat in the hollow quiet of his office, staring out at the rain swallowing the city. Each drop hit the window like the pounding of his own heart, fast, uneven, painful. Then he stood, grabbed his coat. He didn't take anything else, no phone, no umbrella, no plan. Just his car keys and one thought that cut through everything. This time, say it. Say it before it's too late. Mara's small apartment glowed softly, golden light spilling through rain-soaked curtains. She was packing a few paintings into a suitcase when she heard the knock. 3 firm knocks. She froze. She knew that rhythm, knew it too well. Still, she waited a few seconds before opening the door. Grant stood there, drenched, rainwater dripping from his hair, clothes clinging to his frame. No umbrella, no flowers, no grand gesture. Just him, raw, exhausted, painfully real. I don't know how to love you, he said the moment she opened the door. His voice was rough, breaking, but every word landed clear. But I know how to lose you, and I can't do it again. Mara's hand tightened around the doorknob. Outside, the rain fell harder, echoing the wild rhythm in her chest. Grant, she whispered. I've lost everything, he said, words tumbling out in fear that silence might make her close the door. The company, the title, the image, all of it. But none of that scares me like the thought of you truly being gone from my life. She looked at him for a long moment. That face, the one that had once caused her so much pain, now made her want to believe. But reason pulled her back. Grant, what's the point of saying this now? Everything between us, it died a long time ago. No, he said immediately. It didn't die. I buried it, and I finally realized that when I read your letters. Mara froze. You read them? I had no right to, he admitted, but I had to understand how much you'd endured, to see how cruel I'd been. I'm not here to beg for forgiveness. I just want to start over, if you'll let me. She let out a trembling breath, a sad, quiet laugh, tears glinting at the corners of her eyes. Grant, you can't fix 2 years with a storm and a few late words. I know. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But I can learn, this time, not to be the perfect husband, just to be someone worthy of standing next to you. Mara said nothing. She saw in him something she hadn't seen in 2 years, the truth. No mask of control, no practiced calm, no armor of power. Just a man shaking, not from the cold, but from fear of losing her. I don't know, she said quietly. I don't know if there's anything left to save. I don't know either, Grant replied, rain streaming down his hair, his face, his voice raw. But if you close this door right now, I'll still be here, until you're sure I'm not pretending anymore. She stared at him, heart tangled, breath shallow. Part of her wanted to pull him inside. Another part wanted the rain to wash it all away. The pain, the past, the memory of what they were. Between them, only half a meter of air, heavy, trembling, alive. He was shaking, not from cold, but from the fragile weight of hope. Mara drew a long, uneven breath, her hand still resting on the door. Grant, she said softly, sometimes love isn't enough. People have to learn how to let go, just to survive. He nodded faintly, not arguing, just breathing through the ache. I never learned how to do that, he said quietly. Not when the person I have to let go of is you. She looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had once hurt her, now pleading without words. Outside, the rain hammered against the roof, each drop sounding like a heartbeat shattering on impact. After a silence that stretched into forever, Mara shook her head gently. I'm sorry, she whispered. The door closed. The soft click echoed louder than any thunder. Outside, Grant didn't move. Rain poured down, soaking through his clothes, his skin, his breath. He stood there, eyes fixed on the door that no longer opened to him. He didn't knock again, he didn't call her name. He just stood there, until his figure blurred into the curtain of rain, and all that was left was silence. A different silence this time. One that held a heartbeat breaking quietly inside it. 1 year later, the evening air in the small hall carried the scent of wood and fresh paint. Soft amber light bathed the children's paintings on the walls, each one clumsy, colorful, and full of impossible dreams. At the back corner behind the modest bar stood Grant Hayes, white shirt sleeves rolled up, quietly pouring drinks for guests. No one recognized him as the former CEO of one of the region's biggest tech empires, and for the first time, he didn't need them to. On the small makeshift stage, Mara was speaking, introducing the first fundraising night for the Aurora Fund, a community art foundation that Grant had founded and then stepped away from, giving her complete control. He had done what no one would have believed 2 years earlier, resigned as CEO, handed over his shares, and started from nothing. People called it a rebranding move, a clever way to clean up his image. But only he knew it was the only way left to fight for the one thing that still mattered. From a distance, he watched her. Mara stood among the children, dressed in a simple pale blue dress, her hair loose, her laughter soft and real, no longer restrained, no longer forced. It was a smile that finally belonged to her. Mr. Hayes? A man's voice broke his reverie. Grant turned slightly. Rowan Pierce stood beside him, a glass of wine in hand, wearing that familiar half-smile. Didn't expect to see you playing bartender, Rowan said lightly. Grant met his gaze, calm and unflinching. I've served worse things in my life, he replied. Power, for instance. Rowan chuckled, taking a sip. You've changed. Grant didn't answer. His eyes drifted back toward Mara, where the stage lights bathed her in a soft glow, making her look like part of the very art she'd fought to protect. Rowan followed his gaze, then gave a small, knowing nod. She's happy, and this time it seems it's because of you. Grant smiled faintly. No pride, no defense, just quiet acceptance, the kind that finally felt like peace. As the ceremony began, Mara stepped up to the podium. Her voice filled the quiet hall, gentle yet deep, every word chosen as if it carried a piece of her heart. Sometimes, she said, people only understand the value of silence once it's gone, and some are brave enough to learn how to love again, even if it's late. Applause rippled through the room. Grant lowered his head slightly, his lips pressed tight, his chest tightening, not from regret, but from recognition. She wasn't speaking to him directly, yet somehow every word was theirs. He stood among the crowd, not moving, not interrupting, just watching her, and realizing that this, finally, was enough. When the event ended and the guests slowly drifted out, Mara stayed behind to gather a few papers. When she turned around, Grant was already there, wiping a small spill from the table with a folded cloth. They looked at each other. "You're still not used to standing in the background, are you?" she asked softly, teasing just a little. "I'm learning," he said, smiling, a rare, quiet smile that reached his eyes this time. "This time, I don't want to miss anything." She nodded, saying nothing. For a moment, there was only silence, soft piano music drifting faintly through the speakers, like an echo of something unfinished. Then Mara reached into her bag and pulled out a worn sheet of paper, its edges slightly creased. I think you should have it," she said. Grant took it, unfolding it carefully. It was their marriage contract, the same one that had once defined the distance between them. The line, "expires after 24 months," was still there, bold and cold. But beneath it, in her familiar handwriting, a new sentence had been added. "Renewal, indefinite." He looked up at her, eyes never leaving hers. "Are you sure?" "No," she said with a half-smile, eyes glimmering. "But I want to try believing again. This time, not for anyone else." Grant tightened his grip on the paper, as if afraid it might dissolve in his hands. No vows, no promises, just their eyes meeting, deeper than any words could reach. Mara picked up her coat and turned toward the door. "You coming?" she asked softly. "It's drizzling outside and I still hate walking alone." He set his glass down and followed her. They walked side by side, not touching, not speaking. Only when they stepped out into the night did her hand brush against his, a small, unplanned touch, soft and instinctive as breath. Outside, the city lights spilled across the wet pavement, their reflections glowing in both their eyes. The same hue of quiet warmth, calm, and truth. "I used to think love was an action." Grant's voice came low, steady, almost to himself. "Something to win, to possess. But maybe love is just learning how to look at someone you once made a stranger and not look away again." They kept walking, their hands still barely touching, a fragile connection, real and enough. There was no silence anymore, only two heartbeats finding the same rhythm beneath the rain and the light. Because this time he wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to understand and to keep.